Round the Fire, Part 2. The Story of the Man with the Watches. There were many who will still bear in mind the singular circumstances which, under the heading of Rugby Mystery, filled many columns of the daily press in the spring of the year 1892. Coming as it did at a period of exceptional dullness, it attracted perhaps rather more attention than it deserved. But it offered to the public that mixture of whimsical and the tragic which is most stimulating to the popular imagination. Interest drooped, however, when, after weeks of fruitless investigation, it was found that no final explanation of the facts was forthcoming, and the tragedy seemed from time to the present this having taken its place in the dark catalogue of inexplicable and unexplained crimes. A recent communication, the authority of which appears to be above question, has, however, thrown some light and new upon the matter. Before laying it before the public, it would be as well, perhaps, that I should refresh the memories as to the singular facts upon which this commentary is founded. These facts were as briefly follows. At 5 o'clock in the evening of March 18th, in the year already mentioned, a train left Euston Station for Manchester. It was a rainy, squally day which grew wilder as it progressed, so it was by no means the weather in which anyone would travel who was not driven to do so by necessity. The train, however, is a favorite among Manchester businessmen who are returning from town, for it does the journey in 4 hours and 20 minutes, with only 3 stoppages upon the way. In spite of the inclement evening, it was, therefore, fairly well filled upon the occasion on which I speak. The guard of the train was a tired servant of the company, a man who had worked for 22 years without blemish or complaint. His name was John Palmer. The station clock was upon the stroke of 5, and the guard was about to give the customary signal to the engine driver when he observed 2 belated passengers hurrying down the platform. One was an exceptionally tall man, dressed in a long black overcoat with an astrakhan collar and cuffs. I've already said that in the evening, an inclement one, and the tall traveler had a high, warm collar turned up to protect his throat against the bitter March wind. He appeared, as far as the guard could judge, to be hurried in inspection. To be a man in between 50 and 60 years of age, who had retained a good deal of his vigor and activity of his youth. In one hand he carried a brown leather Gladstone bag. The companion was a lady, tall and erect, walking with a vigorous step which outpaced the gentleman beside her. She wore a long, fawn-colored dust cloak, a black, close-fitting toque, and a dark veil which concealed the greater part of her face. The two might very well have passed for father and daughter. They walked swiftly down the line of carriages, glancing in windows until the guard, John Palmer, overtook them. "Now then, sir, look sharp. The train is going," he said. "First class," the man answered. The guard turned the handle of the nearest door. In the carriage which he had opened, there sat a small man with a cigar in his mouth. His appearance seemed to have impressed itself upon the guard's memory, for he was prepared afterwards to describe or to identify him. He was a man of 34 or 35 years of age, dressed in some gray material, sharp-nosed, alert, with a ruddy, weather-beaten face and a small, closely cropped black beard. He glanced as the door was opened. The tall man paused with his foot upon the step. "This is the smoking compartment. The lady dislikes smoke," he said, looking round to the guard. "Oh, right, here you are, sir," said John Palmer. He slammed the door of the smoking carriage, opened that of the next one, which was empty, and thrust the 2 travelers in. At the same moment, he sounded his whistle, and the wheels of the train began to move. The man with the cigar was at the window of his carriage, and had said something to the guard as he rolled past him, but the words were lost in the bustle of the departure. Palmer stepped into the guard's van as it came up to him, and thought no more of the incident. 12 minutes after its departure, the train reached Whistledown Junction, where it stopped for a very short interval. An examination of the tickets has it made certain that no one either joined or left it at this time, and no passenger was seen to alight upon the platform. At 5:14, the journey to Manchester was resumed, and Rugby was reached at 6:50, the express being 5 minutes late. At Rugby, the attention of the station officials was drawn to the fact that the door of one of the first-class carriages was open. An examination of the compartment and of its neighbor disclosed the remarkable state of affairs. The smoking carriage in which the short, red-faced man with a black beard had been seen was now empty. Save for a half-smoked cigar, there was no trace whatever of its recent occupants. The door of the carriage was fastened. In the next compartment, to which attention had been originally drawn, there was no sign either of the gentleman with the astrakhan collar or of the young lady who accompanied him. All the 3 passengers had disappeared. On the other hand, there was found upon the floor of this carriage, the one in which all the traveler and the lady had been in, a young man, fashionably dressed and of an elegant appearance. He lay with his knees drawn up and his head resting against the further door, an elbow upon either seat. A bullet had penetrated his heart, and his death must have been instantaneous. No one had seen such a man enter the train, no railway ticket was found in his pocket, nor were there any markings upon his linen, nor papers of personal property, which might be help to identify him. Who was he? Whence had he come? And how had he met his end? Were such a great mystery as what had occurred to the 3 people who had started an hour and a half before Rosenden in those 2 compartments. I've said that there was no personal property which might help to identify him, but it is true that there was one peculiarity about his unknown man which was commented upon much of the time. In his pockets were found no fewer than 6 valuable gold watches, 3 in the various pockets of his waistcoat, 1 in his ticket pocket, 1 in his breast pocket, and 1 fastened around his wrist. The obvious explanation was that the man was a pickpocket, and that this was his plunder. It was discounted by the fact that all 6 were American make, and of a type which is rare in England. 3 of them bore the mark of the Rochester Watchmaking Company. 1 was by Mason of Elmira, 1 was unmarked, and the small one, which was highly jeweled and ornamented, was from Tiffany of New York. The other contents of his pockets consisted of an ivory knife with a corkscrew by Rogers and Sheffield, a small circular mirror 1 inch in diameter, a readmission slip to the Lyceum Theatre, a silver box of Vesta matches, and a brown leather cigar case containing 2 caroots, also £2 14 shillings in money. It was clear that whatever motives may have led to his death, robbery was not among them. As already mentioned, there were no markings upon the man's linen, which appeared to be new, and no tailor's name upon his coat. In appearance, he was young, short, smooth-cheeked, and delicately featured. One of his front teeth was conspicuously stopped with gold. On the discovery of this tragedy, an examination was instantly made of the tickets of all passengers, and the number of the passengers themselves was counted. It was found that only 3 tickets were unaccounted for, corresponding to the 3 travelers who were missing. The express was then allowed to proceed, but a new guard was sent in with it, and John Palmer was detained as a witness at Rugby. The carriage, which included the 2 compartments in question, was uncoupled and sidetracked. Then, on the arrival of Inspector Vane of Scotland Yard, and of Mr. Henderson, a detective in the service of the railway company, an exhaustive inquiry was made into all the circumstances. That crime had been committed was certain. The bullets, which appeared to have come from a small pistol or revolver, had been fired from some little distance, as there was no scorching on the clothes. No weapon was found in the compartment, which finally disposed of the theory of suicide, nor was there any sign of the brown leather bag which the guard had seen in the hand of the tall gentleman. The lady's parasol was found upon the rack, but no other trace was to be seen of the travelers in either of the sections. Apart from the crime, the question of how or why the 3 passengers, one of them a lady, could get out in the rain, and one other get in during the unbroken run between Windleston and Rugby, was one which excited the utmost curiosity among the general public, and gave rise to much speculation in the London press. John Palmer, the guard, was able to, at the inquest, give some evidence which threw a little light upon the matter. There was a spot between Tring and Cheddington, according to his statement, where, on account of some repairs to the line, the train had a few minutes slowed down to a pace not exceeding 8 and 10 miles an hour. At that place it might be possible for a man, or even for an exceptionally active woman, to have left the train without serious injury. It was true that the gang of platelayers was there, and that they had seen nothing, but it was their custom to stand in the middle between the metals, and the open carriage was upon the far side, so that it was conceivable that someone might have alighted unseen, and the darkness would by that time be drawing in. The steep embankment would instantly screen anyone who sprang out from the observation of the nighters. The guard also deposed that there was a good deal of movement on the platform at Wildersham Junction, and that, though it was certain that no one had either joined or left the train there, it was quite possible that some of the passengers might have changed unseen from one compartment to another. It was by no means uncommon for a gentleman to finish the guard in a smoking carriage and then to change to a clear atmosphere. Supposing that man with the black beard had done so at Wilderton, and the half-smoked cigar upon the floor seems to favor this supposition, would naturally go into the nearest section, which would bring him into the company of the two other actors in this drama. Thus the first stage of the affair might be surmised without any great breach of probability, but what the second stage had been, or how the final one had been, arrived at, neither the guard nor the experienced detective officers could suggest. A careful examination of the line between Willesden and Rugby resulted in not discovery which might or might not have bearing in on the tragedy. Near Tring, the very place where the train slowed, there was found at the bottom of an embankment a small pocket testament, very shabby and worn. It was printed by the Bible Society of London and bore the inscription, "From John to Alice, January 13th, 1856. Upon the flyleaf, underneath was written, James, July 4th, 1859, and beneath that again, Edward, November 1st, 1869, all the entries being in the same handwriting. This was the only clue, if it could be called a clue, which the police obtained, and the coroner's verdict of murder by a person or persons unknown was an unsatisfactory ending in a singular case. Advertisements, rewards, and inquiries proved equally fruitless, as nothing could be found which was solid enough to form the basis of a profitable investigation. It would be a mistake, however, to suppose that no theories were formed to account for the facts. On the contrary, the press, both in England and in America, teemed with suggestions and suppositions, most of which were obviously absurd. The fact that the watches were of American make and some peculiarities in the connection with the gold stopping at his front tooth appeared to indicate that the deceased was a citizen of the United States, though his linen, clothes, and boots were undoubtedly of British manufacture. It was surmised by some that he was concealed under the seat, and that being discovered, he was for some reason, probably because he had overheard their guilty secrets, put to death by the fellow passengers. When coupled with the generalities of the ferocity and the cunning anarchical and other secret societies, this theory sounded as plausible as any. The fact that he should be without a ticket would be consistent with the idea of concealment, and it was well known that the women played a prominent part of the nihilistic propaganda. On the other hand, it was clear from the guard's statement that the man must have been hidden there before the others arrived. And how unlikely the coincidence that conspirators should stray exactly into the very compartment in which a spy was already concealed. Besides, this explanation ignored the man in the smoking carriage and gave no reason at all for his simultaneous disappearance. The police had little difficulty in showing that such a theory could not cover the facts, but they were unprepared in the absence of evidence to advance any alternative explanation. There was a letter in the Daily Gazette over the signature of a well-known criminal investigator, which gave rise to considerable discussion at the time. He had formed a hypothesis which had at least ingenuity to recommend it, and I cannot do better than to apprehend it in his own words. Whatever may be the truth, he said, it must depend upon some bizarre and rare combination of events, so we need to have no hesitation in postulating such events in our explanation. In the absence of data, we must abandon the analytic or scientific method of investigation, and we must approach it in a synthetic fashion. In a word, instead of taking known events and deducing from them what has occurred, we must build up a fanciful explanation if it will only be consistent with the known events. We can then test the explanation by any fresh facts which may arrive. If they all fit into their places, the probability is that we were upon the right track. And with each fresh fact, this probability increases in a geometrical progression until the evidence becomes final and convincing. Now, there is one most remarkable suggestive fact which has not met with the attention in which it deserves. There is a local train running through Harrow and King's Lane, which is timed in such a way that the express must have overtaken it, or about the period when it eased down to a speed of 8 miles an hour on account of the repairs of the line. Two trains would at that time be traveling in the same direction at a similar rate of speed and upon parallel lines. It is within everyone's experience how, under such circumstances, the occupant of each carriage can see very plainly the passengers of the other carriages opposite them. The lamps of the express had been lit at Wildenton, so that each compartment was brightly illuminated, and most visible to an observer from outside. Now, the sequence of events I reconstruct them would be after this fashion. The young man with the abnormal number of watches was alone in a carriage of the slow train. His tickets with his papers and gloves and other things was, we shall suppose, on the seat beside him. He was probably an American, and also probably a man of weak intellect. The excessive wearing of jewelry is an early symptom in some forms of mania. As he sat watching the carriages on the express, which, on the account of the state of the line, were going at the same pace as himself, he suddenly saw some people in it whom he knew. We will suppose for our sake that the theory that these people were a woman whom he loved and a man whom he hated, and who in turn hated him. The young man was excitable and impulsive. He opened the door for his carriage and stepped from the footboard of the local train to the footboard of the express, opened the other door, and made his way into the presence of these two people. The feat, on the supposition that the trains were going at the same pace, is by no means so perilous as it might appear. Having now got our young man without his ticket in the carriage, in which the elder man and the young woman are traveling, it is not difficult to imagine that a violent scene ensued. It is possible that the pair were also Americans, which is more probable as the man carried a weapon, an unusual thing in England. If our supposition is in septimania is correct, the young man is likely to have assaulted the other. As the upshot of the quarrel, the elder man shot the intruder, then made his escape from the carriage, taking the young lady with him. We will suppose that this all happened very rapidly, and that the train was still going at a very slow pace, as it is not difficult for them to leave it. The woman might leave a train going at 8 miles an hour. A matter of fact, we know that this woman did so. And now we have to fit the man in the smoking carriage. Presuming that we have, up to this point, reconstructed the tragedy correctly, we shall find nothing in this other man to cause us to reconsider our conclusions. According to my theory, this man saw the young fellow cross from one train to the other, saw him open the door, heard the pistol shot, saw the two fugitives spring out to the line, realized the murder had been done, and sprang out himself in pursuit. Why he has never been heard of since, whether he might have met his death in the pursuit, or whether, as is more likely, he was made to realize that it was not a case for his interference, is a detail which we have present no means of explaining. I acknowledge that there are some difficulties in that way. At first sight, it might seem improbable that such a moment of murderer would broad himself in this light with a plastic brown leather bag. My answer is that he was well aware that if the bag were found, his identity would be established. It was absolutely necessary for him to take it with him. My theory stands or falls upon one point. and I call upon the railway company to make strict inquiry as to whether a ticket was found unclaimed in the local train through Harrow and King's Langley upon the 18th of March. If such a ticket were found, my case is proved. If not, my theory may still be a correct one, for it is conceivable either that he traveled without a ticket, or that he left his tickets for lost. To this elaborate and plausible hypothesis, the answer of the police and the company was, first, that no such ticket was found; secondly, that the slow train would never run parallel to the express; and thirdly, that the local train had been stationed at King Langley Station when the express, going at 50 miles an hour, had flashed past it. So appears the only satisfactory explanation, and 5 years have elapsed without supplying a new one. Now at last there comes a statement which covers all the facts, and which must be regarded as authentic. It took the shape of a letter dated from New York and addressed to the same criminal investigator whose theory I have quoted. It is given here in extenso, in the exception of the 2 opening paragraphs, which are personal in their nature. You'll excuse me if I'm not very free with names. There's less reason now than there was 5 years ago when Mother was still living. But for all that, I'd rather cover up our tracks all I can. But I owe you an explanation. For if your idea of it was wrong, it was a mighty ingenious one all the same. I'll have to go back a little so you may understand all about it. My people came from Bucks, England, and immigrated to the States in the early 50s. They settled in Rochester and then stayed in New York, where my father ran a large dry goods store. There were only 2 sons, myself, James, and my brother Edward. I was 10 years older than my brother, and after my father died, I sort of took the place of a father took, as an elder brother would. He was a bright, spirited boy, and just one of the most beautiful creatures that ever lived. But there was always a soft spot in him, and it was like mold and cheese, for it spread and spread, and nothing that you could do would stop it. Mother saw it just as clearly as I did, but she went on spoiling him all the same, for he had such a way with him that you could refuse him nothing. I did all I could to hold him in, but he hated me for my pains. At last he fairly got in his head, and nothing that we could do to stop him. He got off into New York, and went rapidly from bad to worse. At first he was only fast, and then a criminal. And then, at the end of a year or 2, he was one of the most notorious young crooks in the city. He was formed a friendship with Sparrow McCoy, who was at the head of the profession as a bunco steerer, green goodsman, and general rascal. They took to card sharping, and frequently some of the best hotels in New York. My brother was an excellent actor. He might have made an honest name for himself if he had chosen, and he would take the parts of a young Englishman of title, and of a simple lad from the West, or of a college undergraduate, whatever suited Sparrow McCoy's purpose. And then one day he dressed himself as a girl, and he carried it off so well that he made such himself a valuable decoy, that if it was their favorite game afterwards, they had made it right with Tammany and with the police, so it seemed that nothing could ever stop them. Those were the days before the Lennox Commission, and if you could only had a pull off, you could do pretty much anything you wanted. And nothing would have stopped them if they had only struck the cards in New York, but they must needs to come up to Rochester way, and forge a new name on a check. It was my brother that did that, though everyone knew it was under the influence of Sparrow McCoy. I brought up the check, and a pretty sum it cost me. Then I went to my brother, laid it before him on the table, and swore to him that I would not prosecute if he did not clear out of the country. At first he simply laughed. I could not prosecute, he said, without breaking our mother's heart, and he knew that I would not do that. I made him understand, however, that our mother's heart was being broken in any case, and that I had set firm on the point that I would rather see him in Rochester gaol than in a New York hotel. So at last he gave in, and he made me a solemn promise that he would see Sparrow McCoy no more, and that he would go to Europe, and that he would turn his hand to any honest trade that helped him get it. I took him down right away to an old family friend, Joe Wilson, who was an exporter of American watches and clocks, and I got him to give Edward an agency in London with a small salary and a 5% commission on all business. His manner and his appearance were so good that he won the old man over at once, and within a week he was sent off to London with a case full of samples. It seemed to me that the business of the check had really given my brother a fright, and that there was some chance of his settling into an honest line of life. My mother had spoken to him, and she said that she had touched him, for she had always been the best of mothers to him, and he had been the great sorrow of her life. But I knew that this man, Sparrow McCoy, had a great influence over Edward, and my chance of keeping the lad straight lay in keeping a connection between them. I had a friend in the New York detective force, and through him I kept a watch on McCoy. And within a fortnight of my brother's sailing, I heard that McCoy had taken a berth at Ertrina. I was certain, if he had told me that he was going over to England for the purpose of coaxing Edward back again into the ways that he had just left. In an instant I had resolved to go also, and I put my influence against McCoy's. I knew it was a losing fight, but I thought that, and my mother thought, that if it was my duty. We passed the last night together in prayer for my success, and she gave me her own testaments that my father had given her on the days of their marriage in the old country, so that I might always wear it next to my heart. I was a fellow traveler on a steamship with Sparrow McCoy, and at least I had the satisfaction of spoiling his little game for the voyage. But the very first night I went into the smoking room and found him at the head of a card table, with half a dozen young followers who were carrying their full purses and their empty skulls over to Europe. He was settling down for his harvest, and a rich one it would have been too, but I soon changed all of that. "Gentlemen," I said, "are you aware with whom you are playing?" "What's that to you? Mind your own business," he said with an oath. "Who is it anyway?" asked one of the dudes. "He's Sparrow McCoy, the most notorious card sharper in the States." Up he jumped with a bottle in hand, but he remembered that he was under the flag of an effete old country, where law and order and tammany was no pull. Jail and the gallows wait for violence and murder, and there's no slipping out the back door on board an ocean liner. "Prove your words, you," he said. "I will," said I. "If you will turn up your right sleeve to his shoulder, I will prove either my words or I will eat them." He turned white and said not a word. You see, I knew something of his ways, and I was aware that he kept part of a mechanism which he and all such sharpers were consistent to elastic down the arm with a clip just above the wrist. It is by means of this clip that they withdraw from their hands the cards which they do not want, while they substitute other cards from other hiding place. I reckoned on it being there, and it was. He cursed me and slunk out of the saloon, and was hardly seen again during the voyage. For once, at any rate, I got level with Mr. Sparrow McCoy. But he was soon his revenge on me, for when it came to influencing my brother, he outweighed me every time. Edward had kept himself straight in London for the first few weeks, and had done some business with his American watches until this villain came across his path once more. I did my best, but the best was little enough. And next thing I heard, there was been a scandal in one of the Northumberland Avenue hotels. A traveler had been fleeced of a large sum of money by two Confederate card sharp players. The matter was in the hands of Scotland Yard. The first I learned of it was in the evening paper, and I was at once certain that my brother and McCoy were back to throw games. I hurried at once to Edward's lodgings. They told me that he had been with a tall gentleman, whom I recognized as McCoy, had gone off together, and that he had left his lodgings and taken his things with him. The landlady had heard them give several directions to a cabman handing in Euston Station, and she had accidentally overheard the tall gentleman saying something about Manchester. She believed that this was their next destination. A glance at the timetable showed me the most likely train was at 5, though there was another at 4:35 which might have caught. I had only time to get to the latter one, but found no sign of them either in the depot or in the train. They must have gone on the earlier one, so I determined to follow them to Manchester and search them for the hotels there. One last appeal to my brother, by all that he owed to my mother, might even now be the salvation of it. My nerves were overstrung, and I lit a cigar to steady them. At that moment, just as the train was moving off, the door of my compartment was flung open, and there were McCoy and my brother on the platform. They were both disguised, and with good reason, for they knew that the London police were after them. McCoy had great astrakhan collar drawn up, so that only his eyes and nose were showing. My brother was dressed like a woman with a black veil half down his face, but of course it did not deceive me for an instant, nor would it have done so even if I had not known that he had so often done such a dress before. I started up, and I did as McCoy recognized me. He said something to the conductor, and he slammed the door again. They were shown to the next compartment. I tried to stop the train as to follow them, but the wheels were already moving, and it was too late. When we stopped at Wilsondon, I instantly changed my carriage. It appears that I was not seen doing so, which is not surprising as the station was crowded by people. McCoy, of course, was suspecting me, and had spent the time between Euston and Wilson saying all he could to harden my brother's heart and set him against me. That is what I fancy, for I had never found him so impossible to soften to move. I tried this way and then tried that, and pictured the future of the English jail, and I described the sorrow of his mother when I came back with the news. I said everything to touch his heart, but all to no purpose. He sat there with a fixed sneer upon his handsome face, while every now and then Sparrow McCoy would throw in a taunt to me, and some word of encouragement to hold my brother to his resolutions. "Why don't you run a Sunday school?" he would say to me, and then, in the same breath, "He thinks you have no will of your own. He thinks you're just a baby brother that he can lead where he likes. He's only just finding out that you're a man as well as he." It was words of his which set me talking bitterly. We left Rosendon, as you understand, for all this took some time. My temper got the better of me, and for the first time in my life I let my brother see the rough side of me. Perhaps it would have been better had I done so earlier and more often. "A man," I said. "Well, I'm glad to be your friend's assurance of it, for no one would suspect you of seeing it a boarding school missy. I don't suppose in all this country there's a more contemptible-looking creature than you are as you sit there, that dolly pinafore upon you." He colored up to that, for he was a vain man, and he winced from ridicule. "It's only a dust cloak," he said, and he slipped it off. "One has to throw the coppers off one's scent, and I had other ways to do it." I took his toque off with a veil attached, and he put both on the cloak in his brown bag. "Anyway, I don't need to wear it until the conductor comes around," he said. "Not then either," I said, and taking the bag I slung it with all my force out the window. "Now," said I, "prove you'll never make a Mary Jane of yourself while I can help it. If nothing but that disguise stands between you and jail, then to jail you shall go." That was the way to manage him. I felt my advantage at once. His supple nature was one which yielded to roughness far more readily than to entreaty. He flushed with shame, and his eyes filled with tears. But McCoy saw my advantage also, and was determined that I should not pursue it. "Here's my part, and you shall not bully him," he cried. "He's my brother, and you should not ruin him," said I. "I believe a spell of prison is the very best way of keeping you apart, and you shall have it, or it will be no fault of mine." "Oh, you would squeal, would you?" he cried. In an instant he whipped out his revolver. I sprang for his hand, but saw that I was too late and jumped aside. At the same instant he fired. The bullet which would have struck me passed through the heart of my unfortunate brother. He dropped without a groan upon the floor of the compartment, and McCoy and I, equally horrified, knelt at each side of him, trying to bring back some signs of life. McCoy still held the loaded revolver in his hand, but his anger against me and my resentment towards him had both for the moment been swallowed up by the sudden tragedy. It was he who first realized the situation. The train was, for some reason, going very slowly at the moment, when he saw his opportunity for escape. In an instant, he had the door open. But I was as quick as he, and jumping upon him, the two of us fell off the footboard and rolled in each other's arms down the steep embankment. At the bottom, I struck my head against a stone, and I remembered. When I came to myself, I was lying among some low bushes, not far from the railway track, and somebody was bathing my head with a wet handkerchief. It was Sparrow McCoy. "I guess I couldn't leave you," said he. "I didn't want to leave the blood of two of you on my hands in one day. You loved your brother, I have no doubt, but you didn't love him a cent more than I loved him, though you'll say I took a queer way to show it. Anyhow, it seems a mighty empty world now that he's gone, and I don't care a continental whether you give me over the hangman or not." He had turned his ankle in the fall, and there we sat, he with his useless foot, and me with my throbbing head, and we talked and talked until gradually my bitterness towards him softened and turned to something more of sympathy. What was the use of revenging his death upon a man who was such stricken by his death as I was? And then, as my wits gradually returned, I began to realize also that I could do nothing against McCoy, which would not recoil upon my brother and myself. How could we convict him without a full account of my brother's career being made the public, the very thing which all others we had to avoid? It was really as much our interest as his to cover the matter up, and from being an avenger of crime I found myself changed to a conspirator against justice. The place in which we found ourselves was one of those pleasant preserves which are so common in the old country, and as we groped our way through it, I found myself consulting the slayer of my brother as to how far it would be possible to hush it up. I soon realized from what he had said that unless there were some papers on which we knew nothing of his brother's pockets, there was really no possible means by which the police could identify him or learn how he got there. His ticket was in McCoy's pocket, and so was a ticket of some baggage which they had left at the depot. Like most Americans, he found it cheaper and easier to buy an outfit in London than to bring one from New York, so that all his linen and clothes were new and unmarked. The bag containing the dust cloak, which I had thrown out the window, may have fallen among the bramble patch where it is still concealed, or it may have been carried off by some tramp, or may have come into the possession of police who kept the incident to themselves. Anyhow, I've seen nothing about it in the London papers. As to the watches, they were selections from those which had been entrusted to him by business purposes. It may have been for the same business purposes that he was taking them to Manchester, but, well, it's too late to enter into that. I don't blame the police for being at fault. I don't see how it could have been otherwise. There's just one little clue that might have followed up, but that was a small one. I mean that the silver circular mirror that was found in my brother's pocket. It isn't a very common thing for a young man to carry about with him, is it? But a gambler might have told you that which a mirror may mean to a card sharper. If you sit back a little away from the table and lay the mirror face upwards upon your lap, you can see as the detail of every card you give to your adversary. It is not hard to say whether you see a man to raise him when you know his cards as well as your own. It was as much a part of the sharper's outfit as the elastic clip on Sparrow's McCoy's armband. Taking that in connection with the recent frauds at the hotel was the police might have got a hold of one end of the string. I don't think there is much more for me to explain. We got to the village called Amerstam that night in the character of two gentlemen walking upon the tour, and afterwards we made our way quietly to London, whence McCoy went on to Cairo, and I returned to New York. My mother died 6 months afterwards, and I'm glad to say that to this day of her death, she never knew what happened. She was always under the delusion that Edward was learning an honest living in London, and I never had the heart to tell her the truth. He never wrote, but then he never did write at any time, so that made no difference. His name was the last upon her lips. There's just one other thing I have to ask you, sir, and should I take it as a kind of return for this explanation if you would do it to me? You remember the testament that was picked up? I always carried it in my inside pocket, and it must have come out during my fall. I value it highly, for it was a family book on my birth, and my brother's marked by my father at the beginning of it. I wish you would simply apply the proper place and have it sent to me. It can be no possible value to anyone else. If you address it to X, Persano's Library, Broadway, New York, it is sure to come to my hand.